There's a moment most people never talk about honestly. It's not the moment she leaves. It's not the moment she comes closer. It's the moment she realizes you are no longer emotionally available to be managed. That is when the mask often slips. That is when attraction, pride, fear, control, regret, curiosity, and social performance all begin to collide. And if you've lived long enough, you know this truth already. In a world built on appearances, people often don't react when you give too much. They react when you stop. In this video, we're going to break down exactly what tends to happen when a woman realizes you've lost interest, not from a bitter perspective, not from a childish, game-playing mindset, but through the lens of self-respect, emotional discipline, and hard-earned clarity. Because what happens next reveals more than her feelings. It reveals the hidden structure of the connection. It reveals what was real, what was ego, what was comfort, and what only existed because you kept carrying it. And near the end, I want to show you the part most men miss completely. Sometimes her reaction is not the real lesson at all. Sometimes the deeper lesson is what your withdrawal finally forces you to see about yourself. So stay with me, because the final shift is where this stops being about romance and starts becoming about power, peace, and the kind of self-command that changes every relationship you have from this point forward. Let's get into it. Before we begin, what this is really about. A lot of men think losing interest is just an emotional event. It's not. Very often, it's a structural event. For a long time, you may have been the one initiating. You texted first. You checked in. You adjusted your schedule. You explained yourself. You tolerated mixed signals longer than you should have because part of you hoped consistency would eventually be rewarded. And maybe at first, it felt worth it. Maybe you believed patience would create depth. Maybe you thought if you just stayed steady, she would eventually meet you with the same energy. But something changed. Not always overnight. Sometimes it happens slowly, almost too quietly to notice. You get tired. You start seeing the pattern more clearly. You notice that the connection only moves when you push it. You realize your effort is being enjoyed, but not truly reciprocated. And at some point, without announcing it, you begin to step back. You stop chasing. You stop over-explaining. You stop trying to rescue the connection from its own imbalance. And that's when the atmosphere changes. Because now she feels the absence of what she once assumed would always be there. And when someone realizes that your attention is no longer guaranteed, the reaction can be intense, confusing, subtle, dramatic, or deeply revealing. Stoicism teaches us something useful here. Your peace should never depend on whether another person finally recognizes your value. And yet, real life has a way of exposing hidden truths only when you withdraw your energy. So as we go through these stages, don't listen to this like a man trying to manipulate a reaction. Listen like a man trying to understand human nature without being controlled by it. That's a very different mindset. And it will save you from a lot of unnecessary chaos. 1. The chase begins. The first shift is often the simplest, and yet it catches people off guard every time. When you stop pursuing, she starts noticing. Not because silence is magic. Not because detachment is a trick. But because absence creates contrast. And contrast reveals value. When you were always available, your consistency may have blended into the background. Your attention became familiar. Expected. Predictable. She may not have consciously disrespected it, but psychologically, people often assign less weight to what feels permanently accessible. Then you change. You stop filling the space. You stop being the automatic source of validation, reassurance, attention, and emotional momentum. And suddenly there is a gap where your energy used to be. That gap becomes impossible to ignore. This is where curiosity begins. Why is he quieter? Why doesn't he reach out the same way? Why does he seem less available? Did something happen? Did I misread him? Did I push too far? Did I take him for granted? This is the beginning of the chase. Not always dramatic. Sometimes very subtle. A text that comes sooner than usual. A warmer tone. A question she normally wouldn't ask. A random check-in that feels oddly timed. A message that says, "Hey, just thinking about you," even though she hadn't shown much urgency before. In modern life, this can play out in quiet but telling ways. She watches your stories faster. She starts reacting to things she used to ignore. She finds a reason to message you after a long period of cool distance. She suddenly becomes curious about where you've been, what you're doing, who you're around. Sometimes she doesn't even realize she's doing it. She just feels the shift and moves toward the missing energy. Now this is where many men make a mistake. The moment they sense renewed interest, they abandon the very clarity that created the shift. They become available too quickly. They rush to interpret attention as transformation. They mistake pursuit for depth. But a grounded man understands the difference between someone missing access and someone truly valuing connection. Those are not always the same thing. Stoicism reminds us to act from truth, not impulse. If your disinterest is real, if it came from finally respecting your own time, your own limits, your own emotional health, then don't betray that clarity the second she leans forward. Let her come closer if she chooses to. But don't rush to collapse the distance just because the silence finally made your absence visible. Picture a man who used to check his phone every few minutes, hoping for a message. He used to rearrange his evenings around uncertainty. He used to tell himself not to overthink while overthinking everything. Then one day, he stops. He puts his energy back into his work. His body. His sleep. His purpose. His friends. His peace. He becomes present in his own life again. That kind of shift is powerful because it is real. And people can feel when something is real. It has a weight to it. A steadiness. An atmosphere. If she starts moving toward you again, don't treat it as victory. Treat it as information. Observe it. Respect it if it's sincere. But don't abandon yourself to receive it. Because whether she comes back or not, the deeper win is this: you have stopped living at the mercy of someone else's inconsistency. And once that happens, something inside you becomes much harder to control. 2. She tests your resolve. When the dynamic changes, confusion often looks for proof. And proof usually comes in the form of tests. This is where her behavior may become sharper, more provocative, more playful in a way that carries an edge. She may tease you differently. Mention another man casually. Make a remark designed to see if you still care. Become warm, then cold. Interested, then distant. Open, then oddly dismissive. To an untrained man, this feels random. To a disciplined man, it looks like uncertainty searching for leverage. And that doesn't always mean malice. Sometimes it's insecurity. Sometimes it's confusion. Sometimes it's her way of asking a question without having the emotional courage to ask it directly. She wants to know whether your withdrawal is real. She wants to know whether she still has access to your emotional state. She wants to know whether she can still move you. And this is the part that reveals a lot. Because if someone can reliably provoke your reaction, they learn something about your structure. They learn where your ego is exposed. They learn what still controls you. A lot of men fail here. Not because they are weak, but because they haven't yet learned that emotional reaction is often the tax you pay for unhealed attachment. So they explain, defend, prove, correct, argue. They try to clarify the misunderstanding, when in reality the test was never about clarity. It was about emotional access. The harsh truth is this: when you react emotionally to every provocation, you hand away authority. You confirm that your peace is still negotiable. You show that your center still lives outside you. Stoicism offers a very different model. Not suppression. Not coldness. Not fake detachment, but composure. A man who sees the move without becoming the move. A man who notices the bait without swallowing it. A man who understands that not every emotional invitation deserves a response. Think about how this plays out in real life. She jokes about another guy suddenly texting her. You feel the sting. Your chest tightens. Part of you wants to ask questions. Part of you wants to compete. Part of you wants to remind her what you bring to the table. But the stronger move is often much quieter. You remain calm. You don't scramble. You don't interrogate. You don't perform wounded pride. You don't try to reclaim a position through force. You simply refuse to become reactive. Or maybe she becomes oddly dismissive after sensing your distance. Maybe she takes longer to reply. Maybe her tone becomes slightly colder, almost as if she's punishing you for no longer playing your former role. A younger version of you might have rushed to fix the atmosphere. A more centered version of you recognizes what's happening and stays with himself. This matters because people watch your nervous system more than your words. They notice whether you are stable. They notice whether you unravel under pressure. They notice whether your confidence survives discomfort. And here is where a Machiavellian truth, stripped of its cruelty, becomes useful. Society often rewards appearances while quietly testing substance. Many people speak in the language of sincerity, but behave in the language of leverage. That is why calm matters so much. Calm lets you see the game without having to play it badly. Imagine a lake on a windy day. The surface trembles with every gust. But below that movement, the deeper water remains still. That is your goal. Not to look unaffected. To become unaffected in the places that matter. When she tests your resolve and finds composure instead of chaos, the entire structure changes. Because now she is no longer dealing with the version of you that could be easily pulled back into uncertainty. Now she is dealing with a man who can feel tension without becoming ruled by it. That leaves an impression. Not because it is manipulative, but because it is rare. Most people, when emotionally activated, become loud, defensive, impulsive, or needy. When you remain dignified, measured, and steady, you communicate something more powerful than explanation. I do not need to lose myself to prove I care. And I do not need to react to prove I exist. That kind of restraint changes how people see you. More importantly, it changes how you begin to see yourself. 3. She tries harder to impress you. Once she realizes the old access no longer works the same way, another phase often begins. She starts trying harder. This can show up in many forms. Her messages become more thoughtful. Her tone softens. She reaches out more often. She seems more attentive, more present, more emotionally available. Maybe she suddenly remembers details she once overlooked. Maybe she listens more carefully. Maybe she becomes more agreeable. Maybe she shows up looking more polished when she knows she'll see you. Sometimes the change is subtle. Sometimes it's obvious enough that even your friends notice it. They'll say things like, "Funny how she's putting in effort now." And if you've been through this before, you know exactly how strange that moment feels. Because part of you is flattered. Part of you is vindicated. And part of you is quietly asking the question that matters most: why now? That question matters. Because effort is not always evidence of growth. Sometimes effort is simply the body's response to threatened loss. Human nature is paradoxical. People often ignore stability while chasing stimulation. They overlook loyalty while responding intensely to uncertainty. And when what felt secure becomes less secure, they suddenly discover new emotional energy. Not always because their values changed, but because the emotional economy changed. That's why you have to be careful here. A lot of men get pulled back in by improved behavior that is more reactive than transformative. They see softness and assume sincerity. They see attention and assume depth. They see temporary effort and assume lasting change. But a mature man slows down enough to examine the source. Is she showing up differently because she sees you differently? Or because she fears losing her former place in your life? Those are two very different realities. Let's bring this into a realistic scene. You stepped back because you were tired of inconsistency. Tired of feeling like the relationship only had warmth when it served her timing. Then suddenly she becomes more affectionate. She asks how your day went. She apologizes for small things she never acknowledged before. She seems more emotionally tuned in. On the surface, this feels like progress. And maybe it is. But before you rush to celebrate it, ask the harder question: has the foundation changed, or has the pressure simply changed? Epictetus taught that we should focus on what is within our control and release what is not. Her reaction is not under your control. Her effort is not under your control. Her internal reasons are not under your control. What is under your control is your pace, your discernment, and your willingness not to abandon your standards because attention suddenly became sweeter. Sometimes she will look better, sound better, act better, and still not be ready for the kind of relationship you actually need. That's not cynicism. That's emotional accuracy. And this is where self-respect has to become practical, not poetic. You don't just say you value peace. You protect it. You don't just say you've grown. You prove it by not being seduced by surface-level changes that haven't earned full trust yet. Of course, not every effort is fake. People do wake up. People do realize what they were mishandling. People do change when confronted with loss. But genuine change has a different texture. It is consistent, humble, patient. It does not demand immediate access as a reward for temporary effort. It understands that trust, once weakened, is rebuilt through time, not intensity. So if she begins trying harder, don't become arrogant. Don't punish her. Don't play the role of the cold man enjoying revenge. That's insecurity wearing a darker coat. Instead, stay grounded. Notice the effort. Appreciate what is real. But remain loyal to the reason you stepped back in the first place. Because the right relationship does not require you to betray your clarity in order to receive affection. The right relationship supports the man you are becoming instead of only waking up when he starts walking away. 4. The emotional roller coaster begins. When she realizes your energy has truly changed, her emotions may begin to swing. Frustration. Sadness. Longing. Confusion. Defensiveness. Hope. Withdrawal. Then effort again. This is one of the most human stages in the entire process. And if you're honest, you've probably lived your own version of it too. Whenever something once familiar becomes uncertain, the nervous system reacts. It tries to regain orientation. It tries to make meaning. It tries to protect pride while still wanting connection. So she may bounce between extremes. One day warmer. Another day distant. One moment trying. Another moment acting like she doesn't care. She may replay old interactions in her mind. She may wonder where exactly things shifted. She may regret not seeing your value sooner. Or she may grow irritated that your silence forced her to confront emotions she was comfortable avoiding. This is where many men become confused. They misread emotional fluctuation as a clear sign. But fluctuation is not clarity. It is fluctuation. A woman in this stage may genuinely miss you and still not be ready for the honesty required to repair anything. She may feel your absence deeply and still react through pride. She may want closeness and resent the vulnerability required to admit it. This is why her behavior can feel mixed. Because people often want two opposite things at once, connection and protection. Seneca said that no man is free who is not master of himself. That matters here because her inner storm is not your command center. Your job is not to stabilize yourself by reading every shift in her mood. Your job is to remain stable enough that her inner weather doesn't become your climate. Let's make this real. Maybe she sends a heartfelt message late at night, then seems distant the next day. Maybe she opens up unexpectedly, then disappears for a while. Maybe she acts hurt, then tries to regain control by pretending none of it matters. A man without emotional discipline will chase coherence from her chaos. He will try to decode every change in tone. He will lose sleep trying to interpret what each move means. But a stronger man understands something essential: not every inconsistency requires analysis. Sometimes it simply reveals that the other person is in conflict with themselves. And when that is true, the worst thing you can do is abandon your center and join them in their instability. This doesn't mean becoming cold. It means becoming clear. You can be compassionate without becoming entangled. You can understand that she is struggling without turning her struggle into your mission. You can care without collapsing. That balance is rare. And it is one of the clearest signs of maturity. In a culture that glamorizes emotional intensity, calm can look unfamiliar. Sometimes people mistake calm for indifference because they are used to chaos being the proof of love. But chaos proves very little. A man who can stay measured while still being kind is not detached from reality. He is simply no longer addicted to drama as evidence of meaning. And if she feels the emotional roller coaster while you remain composed, something important happens. She starts to sense that your value does not rise and fall with her emotional availability. That realization can be confronting. Because it means she is no longer relating to someone whose identity depends on being chosen in every moment. So if you see her becoming emotionally inconsistent, don't rush to rescue the rhythm. Let time reveal what words cannot. Let your steadiness say what over-explanation never could. Because in the end, your power is not in controlling her emotional swings. Your power is in not being ruled by them. 5. The silence and observation phase. When words stop carrying the relationship, observation takes over. This is one of the quietest phases, and one of the most revealing. She begins to watch. Not always openly. Not always consciously. But she watches. Your timing. Your energy. Your posture. Your choices. How quickly you respond. Whether you seem affected. Whether your life still moves without her constant involvement. Because once your verbal reassurance disappears, behavior becomes the only language left. And behavior is much harder to fake for long. This is why silence can feel so loud. Not performative silence. Not punishing silence. Not silence used as a cheap tactic. But the silence that comes from no longer chasing explanations, no longer flooding the connection with emotional labor, no longer trying to force mutuality where mutuality should have existed naturally. She starts reading the absence. And in that absence, your actions become amplified. If you are calm, she notices. If you are rebuilding your life, she notices. If you are no longer waiting around, she notices. If your energy feels clean, centered, and unhurried, she notices. Think of the modern version of this. You don't message impulsively anymore. You reply when it makes sense, not from anxiety. You're polite, but no longer eager. You're respectful, but not available for emotional confusion on demand. You don't watch every move. You don't post for effect. You simply live. And because you're not performing, your behavior becomes strangely powerful. She may send a casual text after a long silence. Hey, how have you been? In the past, you might have stared at that message for 20 minutes, wondering what it meant, how fast to respond, whether this was a sign, whether you should say more, whether now was the time to reopen the emotional floodgates. But now, you read it, breathe, and answer from clarity. No bitterness. No hidden plea. No emotional overinvestment. Just calm presence. That kind of response creates a very different impression. Because now she is not speaking to the man who needed the interaction to mean something immediate. She is speaking to a man who can let meaning unfold slowly. That changes everything. Stoicism teaches us to accept things as they are, not as we wish them to be. And nowhere is that more important than in ambiguous connections. When you finally stop trying to control the narrative, you become easier to trust internally. You stop betraying your nervous system just to keep hope alive. This phase also creates something else, reflection. The space you create gives her room to think. When there is no longer constant noise, no longer constant reassurance, no longer constant emotional cushioning from you, she has to sit with her own impressions. Her own choices. Her own role in what happened. That doesn't guarantee awakening. It doesn't guarantee regret. It doesn't guarantee reconnection. But it does remove the distractions. And sometimes that is the first time someone truly sees what they were standing in front of. Now, this is important. If your silence is a tactic to force a reaction, it will eventually carry tension. It will feel artificial. People can often sense that. But if your silence comes from real acceptance, it carries peace. And peace is much more unsettling to people who assume they still had emotional ownership over you. That is why this stage matters. Because you are no longer explaining your value. You are embodying self-possession. And for someone who only fully notices what they can no longer easily reach, that can be louder than any speech you could have given. 6. She rebuilds her guard. If she begins to realize that your withdrawal is not temporary, another shift usually happens. She starts protecting herself. This can look like indifference, distance, a cooler tone, a more controlled version of herself. She may stop reaching out. She may become emotionally harder to read. She may present herself as if none of it matters anymore. But often, this is not peace. It is defense. When people feel that access is truly disappearing, they begin building emotional walls. Not always because they don't care, but because caring now feels risky. Vulnerability becomes expensive. Pride steps in. Self-protection steps in. And suddenly the woman who once seemed emotionally stirred by your distance begins acting like she's above it. This stage can trigger a lot inside a man. Especially if part of him was still hoping her reaction would confirm his value. Because when she hardens, it can feel like erasure. Like maybe none of it mattered. Like maybe you imagined the shift. Like maybe her silence is proof that moving on was easier for her than you wanted to believe. But be careful. Your ego will always try to narrate what it cannot verify. And pride, when wounded, is a terrible interpreter of reality. Marcus Aurelius reminds us that we have power over our minds, not outside events. That means her guard is her business. Her way of coping is her business. Her timeline is her business. Your responsibility is your conduct. So what does mature conduct look like here? It looks like not chasing because you feel her pulling away. It looks like not trying to crack the wall just to prove you still can. It looks like giving space without becoming passive-aggressive. It looks like respecting boundaries without turning respect into resentment. Imagine this scene. She used to reply with warmth after sensing your absence. Then suddenly she goes quiet. Maybe she stops opening the door the way she briefly did. Maybe she becomes hard to reach again. A reactive man takes this personally and rushes back into pursuit, trying to revive the connection before it disappears. A grounded man notices the shift, honors the reality, and refuses to let fear drag him backward. This is difficult. Especially if you still care. Especially if part of you wants one final clear answer. Especially if the silence presses on all your old wounds around rejection, uncertainty, and not being chosen. But this is exactly where self-mastery becomes real. Not in theories. Not in quotes. Not in how you sound when you feel strong. But in how you behave when the outcome is no longer flattering your ego. And there's another truth here that many men overlook. When you remain respectful, steady, and self-contained during her withdrawal, you leave a very different impression than the man who reacts from bruised pride. You become memorable for your dignity, not for your desperation. You become the man who didn't need to tear her down to survive his disappointment. That matters. Not because you are trying to win some invisible contest, but because character is revealed most clearly when the emotional reward is gone. If she is rebuilding her guard, let her. You are not here to invade defenses. You are here to keep your own center clean. You are here to move with strength, not noise. And sometimes the deepest form of power is allowing another person their process while refusing to abandon your own. 7. She tries to spark jealousy. Feeling exposed often makes people reach for leverage. And one of the oldest forms of leverage in relationships is jealousy. This is where she may begin signaling attention from other men, posting more strategically, highlighting social energy, mentioning someone who's pursuing her, creating little windows through which you are supposed to see that she is still desired, still moving, still wanted. Sometimes this is conscious. Sometimes it is not. But the emotional function is similar. It says, if you are no longer going to chase me, maybe I can still provoke movement. Maybe I can still create tension. Maybe I can still remind you that I have options. And in a society built on display, this kind of behavior has become incredibly easy. A photo here. A story there. A carefully framed moment that says just enough without saying anything directly. That's one of the strange realities of modern relationships. People can stage emotional signals publicly while pretending they mean nothing privately. This is where Machiavellian realism becomes useful, not to become cruel, but to become unfold. People do not always present themselves to reveal truth. Often they present themselves to protect image, regain leverage, or control perception. If you don't understand that, you will mistake performance for reality and reaction for meaning. So what should a centered man do when jealousy enters the picture? He returns to the only territory that actually belongs to him, his own mind. Epictetus said it is not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. That line becomes very practical here. Because jealousy only works if you participate in it. It only burns if you keep feeding it your attention. Maybe she posts a photo with another man. Maybe she mentions being taken out. Maybe she suddenly seems louder online than she ever was when the connection was warm. The old version of you might stare too long. Compare too much. Read into every detail. Let your imagination do violence to your peace. But a more disciplined man interrupts the spiral. He recognizes the invitation to react and declines it. Not because he feels nothing, but because he understands that feeling something does not require performance. It does not require retaliation. It does not require self-abandonment. Ask yourself in that moment, does this actually change who I am? Does this alter my value? Does this deserve access to my nervous system? Or is this simply another test of whether my center still lives outside me? That question is powerful. Because it turns jealousy from a trap into a mirror. It shows you exactly where you still need internal work. And here is the paradox that surprises people. When you do not react, the focus often shifts back onto her. Why didn't he bite? Why does he seem calm? Why am I not getting the response I expected? Why does he appear freer than before? Your silence becomes disorienting to anyone who assumed your emotions were still available for activation. And that is not punishment. That is simply what happens when a man stops volunteering his peace to every passing provocation. Now, be careful not to turn this into ego theater. The goal is not to win by looking unaffected. The goal is to actually become less governable by superficial signals. That is what gives you back your life. Because the truth is, jealousy loses power over you the moment you realize this. Anyone who needs to provoke your insecurity in order to feel their value has not yet learned how to build closeness without control. And once you see that clearly, you stop admiring the performance. You begin respecting your own calm more than the emotional spectacle. So if she tries to make you jealous, let the performance stay where it belongs. Outside you. Watch without worshipping. Notice without absorbing. And keep walking your path. That is silent authority. Not noise. Not revenge. Not chasing. Just unshakable ownership over your inner world. 8. Acceptance and adaptation. Eventually, if your withdrawal is real, reality begins to settle. And this is where acceptance often starts. Not all at once. Not in some dramatic cinematic moment. Usually in fragments. A little less resistance. A little less testing. A little less reaching. A little more distance from the emotional turbulence that came before. She starts adapting to the fact that your energy is no longer organized around her. This stage can lead to real growth. For her and for you. Once the initial ego reactions begin to settle, people often face themselves more honestly. She may turn inward. She may start reflecting on her patterns. She may redirect her energy toward her own healing, work, health, friendships, or identity. And painful as that can be to watch from a distance, it is often healthier than a prolonged dance of mixed signals and emotional half-truths. There is something almost stoic in this process, even if she would never call it that. To accept what you cannot control. To stop fighting reality. To begin rebuilding from within. That is not weakness. That is the beginning of emotional adulthood. And for you, this phase asks for something equally important: respect. Respect her process. Respect the ending, if it is an ending. Respect the fact that not every connection is meant to be recovered. Respect the lesson enough not to distort it with bitterness. This can be difficult because by now, you may have gone through your own internal shifts. You may feel stronger, clearer, less attached. But there may still be moments when memory pulls at you. A certain song. A certain time of day. A place you used to associate with her. A quiet question in your mind about what might have happened if things had unfolded differently. That is normal. Growth does not erase feeling. It refines your relationship to feeling. Imagine a woman who initially reacted to your withdrawal with confusion and emotional volatility. Months later, she begins to look different internally. Maybe she becomes more grounded. Maybe she stops reaching for external validation the way she once did. Maybe she pours herself into work or something meaningful. Maybe the loss forced her to confront parts of herself she had ignored. And imagine you, during that same period, rebuilding your own life. Sleeping better. Thinking more clearly. No longer checking your phone with the same desperation. No longer living in emotional suspense. No longer needing every unanswered question to become a personal wound. That is adaptation. And in some strange way, it is one of the most graceful outcomes possible. Because it means the connection, even if it did not last, still became a catalyst for truth. Stepping back is not always about rejection. Sometimes it is about refusing to participate in a pattern that keeps both people small. And when you do that with clarity rather than cruelty, you create the possibility for everyone involved to grow beyond the old dynamic. So if she begins accepting your disinterest and adapting, let that be what it is. Don't interfere just because acceptance makes the silence feel more final. Don't reopen doors out of loneliness if your values still say no. And don't confuse grief with a reason to return to what no longer fits. Sometimes the most honorable thing you can do is let the lesson complete itself. 9. You reflect on your own journey. And now we arrive at the most important part. The part many men skip. The part that separates temporary emotional control from actual transformation. Because in the end, this was never only about how she reacts. It is also about why you changed. Why you lost interest. What you finally saw. What you finally refused. What this experience exposed in you. Sometimes losing interest is not a sign that something failed. Sometimes it is a sign that you evolved. Your standards became clearer. Your nervous system got tired of confusion. Your soul got tired of shrinking itself to keep a connection alive. What once felt exciting no longer felt aligned. What once felt worth chasing began to feel expensive in all the wrong ways. That is not bitterness. That is maturation. Marcus Aurelius teaches that every relationship is a lesson if you are honest enough to receive it. So ask yourself the deeper questions. Not just what did she do, but what did this reveal about me? Did I ignore my own boundaries for too long? Did I confuse effort with intimacy? Did I tolerate ambiguity because I was more afraid of losing the possibility than facing the truth? Did I keep trying to earn something that should have been mutual from the beginning? Did I base too much of my emotional stability on being wanted by one person? Those questions are uncomfortable. But they are where your freedom begins. A lot of people move through heartbreak, disappointment, or disillusionment without extracting the lesson. So they repeat the pattern with a different face. Same overinvestment. Same emotional bargaining. Same blindness to imbalance. Same hope that this time inconsistency will somehow turn into devotion. But a man who reflects honestly breaks that cycle. He stops romanticizing what drained him. He stops calling anxiety chemistry. He stops calling emotional confusion depth. He stops calling one-sided effort love. And this is where the silent authority mindset becomes real. Not in being unreadable. Not in becoming emotionally dead. But in becoming deeply governed by truth instead of appetite. You begin to prefer peace over fantasy. Clarity over pursuit. Reciprocity over obsession. Character over stimulation. That doesn't make you cold. It makes you selective. And selectivity, in a performative world, is often mistaken for distance. But really it is discernment. It is the refusal to keep feeding what cannot nourish you back. Take the good and leave the rest. That principle matters here. Maybe the connection taught you tenderness. Maybe it exposed your blind spots. Maybe it showed you how deeply you can care. Maybe it forced you to develop patience, restraint, or emotional honesty. Good. Keep that. But leave the fantasy that this had to become something more in order to justify the experience. Leave the guilt. Leave the self-betrayal. Leave the part of you that thinks your value increases only when someone finally regrets underestimating you. Because the deepest shift is this: you no longer need her reaction to validate your withdrawal. You no longer need her pursuit to prove your worth. You no longer need her regret to authorize your growth. And that is freedom. So let's bring this all together. When a woman realizes you've lost interest, many things can happen. She may chase. She may test you. She may try harder. She may spiral emotionally. She may go quiet and observe. She may rebuild her guard. She may try to provoke jealousy. She may eventually accept it and adapt. But beneath all of those reactions lies a deeper truth. Your withdrawal often exposes the true architecture of the relationship. It reveals whether the bond was built on mutual respect or on your constant emotional labor. It reveals whether your presence was valued, assumed, or only noticed when it began to disappear. And most importantly, it reveals whether you are finally ready to stop negotiating against yourself just to remain connected. Stoicism teaches us that real strength does not come from controlling others. It comes from mastering your own responses. Machiavellian realism, when purified of cruelty, teaches us that social life is often more strategic, performative, and ego-driven than people admit. Put those together wisely, and you get something powerful: clear eyes, calm nerves, and the ability to move through human behavior without becoming naive or bitter. That is what this video is really about. Not making her miss you. Not making her panic. Not winning some invisible power game. But becoming the kind of man who no longer abandons himself for access, attention, or emotional crumbs. If someone sees your value only when your energy is gone, take the lesson. If someone tests your peace, deepen your discipline. If someone performs for leverage, become less available to performance. And if losing interest has forced you to finally confront your own patterns, don't waste that awakening. Use it. Let it refine you. Let it teach you how to love without chasing, how to care without collapsing, and how to walk away without hatred. That is a different kind of power. A quieter power. A cleaner power. And in a world full of noise, it may be the only power that still leaves your soul intact. If this resonated with you, let me ask you something. What stage have you seen most clearly in your own life? Was it the testing, the silence, the jealousy, or the part where you finally had to face your own patterns? Share it in the comments. Not just for the algorithm, but because someone reading your words may realize they're not the only one living through this. And if this kind of content speaks to you, subscribe and stay close. Because on this channel, we don't chase surface-level advice. We go after the deeper laws underneath behavior, power, self-respect, and peace. Until next time, protect your mind, guard your energy, and remember, when you stop begging life to confirm your worth, you begin to carry a kind of authority that no one can easily manipulate. Stay steady.